I'll start with introducing the panel that we have before you today. My name is Rebecca Shrimpton. I am the Country Director for Australia for the Asia Group. On my left, we have Mr. Chris Quilty, who is Co-Chief Executive Officer and President at Quilty Space. Dr. Tim Parsons, System Entrepreneur and Board Member of the Space Industry Association of Australia. Ms. Aude Vignel, former Chief Technical Officer at the Australian Space Agency and founder of Vignel Space. We have Mr. Kome Isozaki, and we've got this order wrong, I'm sorry. So Raj is next. That is Mr. Rajat Kulshrestha, Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Space Machines. And then on the end, I'm sorry, Mr. Kome Isozaki. He is a Senior Manager at Deloitte Tomatsu Space and Security and Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute. Now, what are we doing here today and why have we got these particular people here to talk to you? Space can seem a very abstract domain and concept, and it seems often very far, far away. But the reality is that it starts a mere 100 kilometres from above our heads. It has no national boundaries, and it is instrumental and practical in our everyday lives. Space can seem the stuff of science fiction and movies, the preserve of secretive government programs, expensive, exquisite, and for only a select few. But we are here today to turn that story on its head. Yes, today space still inspires, just as that first moon landing did, and the human space flight of the mid 20th century made the unreal real. But dramatic changes have fundamentally reshaped both today's reality of space and its future importance to humanity. Access to space has been democratized, with launch costs driven dramatically lower by breakthroughs in technology, by vision, ambition, and drive from commercial companies, including the likes of SpaceX. It has been made more accessible by progress in other technological areas, by miniaturization, by modularization, and the convergence of key technologies that we're all talking about: AI, big data, robotics, and more. Space requires collaboration by its unique nature. Governments must regulate, invest, be good anchor customers and facilitators of national strategy. But today, the commercial sector drives a lion's share of innovation and capability. Space needs and welcomes all, from established spacefaring nations to emerging space powers. Space needs engineers, scientists, medical practitioners and biotechnicians, artists, lawyers, storytellers. It's a truly multidisciplinary domain. So let's unpick this story that we want to tell you today with some of the best minds, some of the most visionary thinkers, and most importantly, some of the doers. Let's start with you, Chris, and let's start really high level, big picture. What are the macro trends that are shaping the space economy, and why is this so consequential?
Yeah, so just by background, I've been a financial analyst writing research on the space industry for over 20 years. And I can say definitively that, within the last 5 years, we've seen more innovation than the prior 20 years combined. Uh, what's driving that? I mean, fundamentally, I hate to say it, it's launch, right? I mean, you don't have a space industry if you can't launch. And launch has always been the primary barrier to commercializing space. And just to give you some numbers, because I'm an analyst, so be aware, we're going to talk numbers. Typically you would get about 80 to 90 launches a year globally that would happen. To put that in context, I didn't check today, but SpaceX is up to 124 at last count, and globally it's more like 250. But it's not just the frequency of getting to space, but it's really the cost that we're going to talk about. And Beck mentioned this, but through all of human history, since we started launching in the 1960s, the cost to get to space didn't matter the country, didn't matter the rocket, was about $10,000 to $20,000 a kilogram. SpaceX has taken that down to about 3,000 with the Falcon 9, half that with the Falcon Heavy, and the Starship, the one that they caught with the chopsticks the other day. You probably all saw that, right? Little bit of neat science fiction. That thing will get down to hundreds or tens of dollars per kilogram. Why is that important? Well, quite simply, the things that you can do in space are driven by the cost of getting there. So, for example, you might not want to mine an asteroid at $20,000 a kilogram, but last year, a company called Astroforge raised 20 million, and they're going to go mine asteroids because they can do it at $3,000 a kilogram. The business case closes. So the space industry, fundamentally, when you looked at the activity that was happening, was primarily government. And even today, in certain segments of the space industry, it's about, in Earth observation, it's 80% defense, government, and civil are the users. In other verticals like satellite communications, and everybody's probably heard of Starlink, there's another space product. Um, these are much more commercial markets. And the bottom line is, when you look at, what does space do for you, or is always the common question. People in the space industry will talk about, cordless vacuums or Velcro or your pillow foam, memory foam on your pillow and things like that. But there's a lot more tangible things. I mean, put aside the GPS that you rely on every day, all your weather information, all the communications that happens. There are going to be products in your everyday life that are manufactured and built in space. And to give you an example of where that's happening, just this year alone, there's two companies, the exploration company out of Germany, Varda Space is in the US, collectively raised $250 million to bring stuff back from space. Varda demonstrated they manufactured a AIDS pharmaceutical drug in space, brought it down. We're seeing other products like manufacturing fiber optic cables, compound semiconductors, and there's a whole group of companies that are now coming into service to actually bring this stuff back to Earth. Um, when you look at the big change, what's the big idea happening in space? I mentioned launch, but it's really commercialization. We have entered the age of commercialization of space. And if you want to put numbers on it, back 10 years ago, there were all of 35 investors that put $300 million of venture money into space companies. That was 10 years ago, 35 and 300 million, less than 300 million. This year, I think we're on track for about 4.5 billion and over 500 investors. And you were seeing, you know, 400 or 500 companies in cislunar space, 100 launch companies, 24 space tugs. You go down the list, there is a bow wave of activity that's happening in the industry. And, again, we had the crypto and AI guys in here before. That stuff's cool. But if you take out the crypto, right, and all the data mining, just take data centers. Data centers consume about 1% or 2%, excuse me, of the power on Earth, probably going to 10%. Um, there is a company by the name of Lone Star Lunar, which is building data centers on the moon. And you might ask, why would you want a data center on the moon? If you ask Chris Stott, the CEO, he'll tell you, he'll go back to the great fire of Alexandria, the Library of Alexandria in 400 BC, and all of pre-human history was lost, and so there is secure storage of all of our data that has to happen, and it is hugely expensive. And he'll point to that, the safety and security of our data. But the reality is, the reason he's doing it is it's cheaper. It's cheaper to store data on the moon. And I've seen the spreadsheet, so I've run the numbers. If you think about the impact of moving that 10% of our power consumption off the Earth and into space, it'll have a real impact on your power bill and really everything with your life.
Thank you. That was a brilliant scene setter and a lot of context and a lot of good data there to ground your claims. Tim, Australia was once a major space player, really integral in some of the big moments in historical space. But we're in a situation where we're kind of playing catch up now. If you could, for us, use Australia as something of a case study to talk about, what Australia can contribute to and benefit from space, and why Australia as a country and any country really should be looking to space. And I'm just going to bring you back to a quote that you said once before that I think is relevant here. And that is, Australia's best space company doesn't even know it's a space company yet. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Chris, that was an amazing stat. Cheaper to store data on the moon. I love that. Brilliant. So I think the another way to look at Australia as a laggard, another way to think about it is actually last mover advantage. Because I like to remember remind a lot of people that Google was the last search engine, not the first search engine. I think the nature of space in the Indo-Pac region and Australia in particular has been one of being fast followers and fast responders. So if we think of Australia, certainly we have been a foundational part of NASA's program. We're a wonderful piece of dirt down in the southern Pacific Ocean with clear skies, with fantastic views of the southern hemisphere. What a great place to do astronomy, radio astronomy, deep space comms. All that kind of stuff, and military comms and coordination of satellite assets and so on from ground. So we've played that role. I think around the region too, the region's kind of been responding now to this new technical innovation. The great thing is that we're deeply integrated, and many of the countries in Indo-Pacific region are similarly deeply integrated in with the US system. 8 countries are members of the Artemis Accords. Australia was one of the first, Japan was one of the first, Singapore, South Korea, India, these are all countries, New Zealand, that are members of this Artemis Accords. We also have security accords like the Quad, like AUKUS, so that it gives us kind of a deep kind of insight and access to the green room, effectively, of the US space program, which is the strength that we have. I think our challenge now as a region and for Australia is deciding, okay, what leadership position might we take? What things might we decide we want to be good at? Not just what we are good at today, but actually what we want to lead and be good at. One of those areas I think is okay. Let's not go it alone. Let's collaborate with our partners. So we have some fantastic case studies. Raj will talk about this. I know some more about how Australia and India are collaborating. We have a long tradition of collaborating with Japan. Japan landed 2 deep space probes in Australia. And we see those kind of opportunities with South Korea, with Taiwan, with Singapore, with Indonesia, another signatory to the Artemis Accords, third most populous nation on the earth, who are really at an interesting crossroads. I think what we're also seeing is we're ambitious now that we're in responding to the US. We pick up signals like, wow, that given that there's 200 plus launches and they're heading to 300, SpaceX wanting to do 200 launches a year and more, there's a constraint in the ability to launch things from the US. There's a traffic constraint. Okay, let's meet that gap. Let's be an alternative place for Japanese, Korean, Singaporean, even Indonesian launch vehicles, and of course Australian launch vehicles to launch and return back to Australia. And then, Chris, to your point about in space manufacturing, we're excited about that area. We're very curious about where it might go. And we also think Australia could be a brilliant place to bring those kind of industrial scale payloads back to ground without the air traffic issues, in a safe way, in a way that's data driven. I think the really big thing that we're also thinking a lot about in Australia and around the region in our conversations is the notion that space is not this thing up there. Actually, we're starting to think of the systems that we use, the services that you use from space as social infrastructure for the future. If you pick up a satellite that all of you, I'm sure, have either in your hand or in your pocket. This is essentially a satellite. It is powered by a bunch of space services for its timing, which is critical for the communication synchronization, of course, for things like weather, of course, for things like ordering Uber Eats or getting to the Doha Forum and not taking the wrong exit off the highway. All of those things come from space services. And so increasingly we're seeing that, okay, how do we make sure that the general public understand that space is not something that happens over there? It's something that affects their everyday life, that drives equity, that drives access, that drives human rights and communication between us all. And so let's get involved in the conversation about what we want from all these new technologies. And I think Australia, we're kind of ambitious to be a leader alongside our partners in that endeavour.
Fabulous. Thank you, Tim. Now, Odd, to move to you, you have a deep heritage in Arianespace and the European Space Agency, but you have invested significantly in your time as Chief Technical Officer at the Australian Space Agency in building out the vision and the strategy for Australian space. That has run into some issues and some obstacles, but tell us, from what you've learned from all of your experience, both in Europe and Australia, what are the key elements of understanding and success in space, and what are the obstacles that you still see?
Thanks for the good question. I'd like to expand a bit on what Tim said, because usually I go into space conference, so it's very interesting to be here today. Very interesting to hear the conversation since Friday evening, because every conversation I had, every panel discussion, there is a link to space for the reason Tim just mentioned. I don't think we realize how much we use space every single day. There is also all the time synchronization of financial market, of grid, the transport, air, sea, land, all that is synchronized because of the time synchronization system that we're using for space. All these examples are civil example. Now put a national security lens to it. And I think we've heard a lot of discussion about the conflicts there is in the region. So put that national security lens into it and think about all this application that space brings to times of conflict. Space has always a dual use, civil use, but of course defense use. So it's a critical technology, a critical infrastructure. What I also like about space is these technology boundaries that both Chris and Tim talked about. The theme of Doha is also innovation. If you want to innovate, do a mission into space, because you're going to innovate. You're going to have to innovate for sure. You need to innovate to solve the problem in space, but you also bring back a lot of this technology on Earth. So that is very important too. And there's also the curiosity, where do we come from? And we want to know more about the solar system. So this expanding our knowledge is also something that attracts me. But what I realized when I was 10 years old, and I was lucky enough to be in French Guiana at that time, and there was the first launch at the European Ariane rockets. And when you see a rocket taking off, roaring in the air, and you feel the vibration in your body, you get addicted to space, and you can never work in any other field than space. So that marked me a lot, and I was 10 years old. But what marked me as well is to see that there was 12 different nations working together for one goal. I've done a lot of different jobs in my life, but space is the only discipline where I could see so many multinational cooperation. When we work together, we achieve big things. And Ariane wouldn't have been the success it's been. I mean, it was the most reliable launcher until SpaceX took over. This wouldn't have been possible. And I will also mention the example when SpaceX was grounded for a few months, exceptionally. American astronauts were put on top of a Soyuz Russian rocket in a Russian Progress module to go into space, because that was the only way they could do it. And there was conflict on Earth. But with the power of space, you can do some diplomatic arrangements that are very unique. So space is a diplomatic tool, and space is very important for your national posture. So I took all that and I arrived in Australia, and I saw the potential of the country. The country is using a lot of space application because it's vast. It's easier to use a satellite in space than running cable on the land. So what can we do with this? It's important to Chris' points. Space is becoming more and more commercial, yes, but government are the main customer for all these space application. And I don't think we're going to change this for any time soon. So I looked into all the capability that Australia had. They didn't know that it could be applied to space. Remote operation from the mining sector, for example, in Australia is very applicable to space, because we're going to have to build an infrastructure on the moon and beyond before sending people there. So looking into the market for Australian space technology, because you need to think what problem you're going to solve. Building technology and capability for not addressing a problem is very dangerous. So looking into the markets in the world and the market addressable by Australia, looking at the capability we had in the sector today, and doing technology roadmap, to doing a national strategy, and also think, what do we want to develop in a sovereign manner, and what are we comfortable with just getting from someone else? And these are questions that are very important to ask yourself for any countries with developing their strategy. Um, so the challenges we have today in Australia is space should be bipartisan. For some reason, this government has other priorities. So a lot of programs have been cut, which is hurting us a lot. So we're looking into cooperation with foreign nations even more than ever. And as Tim did say, we have NASA in the US, we have European Space Agency in Europe. what are we doing in Indo-Pac? And I used to joke that the A in ESA was not for Australian Space Agency, but for Asia-Pac Space Agency. And with all these countries in Indo-Pac, I think that we start having this conversation of creating a space alliance to do mission together, because we have the same problems. We have a lot of maritime areas. We want to do mission to the moon. So there's a big opportunity to do something there in the region. So don't forget that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Odd. For me, I'm going to actually come to you next, if I may. And I want to pull on that thread of national security. Your background is defense, Ministry of Defense, and very much space security. How is Japan thinking about space and its national interests and its priorities in space? Do you find that you're attracted to Odd's idea and others who say, you know, the collaboration in our region is essential and we really need to look at how we work together and not just pursue things on our own?
Yes, of course. Thank you. Thank you for Doha Forum and Austrian Strategic Policy Institute for providing me an opportunity to be on the great panel and providing me an opportunity to come into the Middle East. So answering to the Beck's question, so I think it's international collaboration is really important and significant for the all players in space. I see the more and more countries are involved in space, and everyday life is we depend on the space systems, space technologies, although we may not really realize all the time. And many countries are involved in space business, also more private uh, companies, more commercialized space phenomena is very impressive, as the Chris mentioned, and in the past 10 years. So I just want to touch upon the Japan's like a space policy transformation in the last 10 years. And after World War II, Japan lost sovereignty, and Japan was banned to research on space technology and aircraft technology. So Japan could be involved in a space and aircraft productions research areas. But in 1950s, Japan's um, academics like Professor Itoka of University of Tokyo studied the pencil rocket, so very small rocket researches. That is a very scientific academic endeavor to do some space business in Japan. So 1950s, Japan started very small civilian academic space technology development. So that lasted the next maybe 40 years. A very civilian-led space scientific ventures, space scientific researches in Japan. In the 1969, the Japanese Diet Parliament passed a resolution for the peaceful use for space that banned the military establishment to develop space technology and the researches. They are only allowed to use space technologies. So the like maritime self-defense forces, so their coverage, their operation areas is global. So they need to use the satellite communications. So those communications, weather forecasts, those kind of generalized use of space are only allowed. So Japanese military is sort of users of space, not the developer or operators of space. That is maybe unique point of Japan's space development histories. But in 1998, so North Korea launched Tepodon missile, the ballistic missiles flying over Japanese archipelago. That kind of changed Japanese publics or politics and about the space policy. So Japan decided to introduce ballistic missile defense systems co-developed with the United States. And Japan also decided to possess own information gathering satellites after 1998. So that is kind of national security use of space technology in Japan. In the last 10 years, after the 2006 or 7, China did anti-satellite missile testing. That created more than 3,000 debris in space. And so that alarmed Japanese public and politicians. And that next year, Japan passed basic space law that revised the Diet resolution on peaceful use of space. So by introducing the basic space law, Japan put a basic space plan that made use of space for national security, industries, and scientific research. So scientific research comes at third. The first is the national security purposes. That is can be transformation of Japan's space policies in 2008. And in the last 10 years, we saw the development of Japan's national security apparatus under the late Prime Minister Abe. So Japan introduced the first national security strategy in 2016, and Japan passed the law to enable the national security apparatus to cooperate, establish a national security council. The National Security Council made a strategy to include the space as a purpose, national security as a use of space for national security purposes. And also, most recently in 2022, so everybody knows that in February, Russia invaded Ukraine, and that is kind of influenced a lot in Japan's public psyche or national security policies, because Japan thought invasion by Russia is kind of permanent member of the National Security Council, kind of ignore the international law, kind of undermining the United Nations charters. So that is kind of premises of the Japan's national security policies is kind of broken. So Japan passed new, transformed the national defense strategies that include doubling the defense budget to the GDP 2%. Also, Japan decided to possess counter-strike capabilities. Those counter-strike and satellite constellations that requires space systems. But Japan's industries has been on civilian-led technologies. For the national security purposes, Japan needs to have a new kind of cultures, technology, industrial corporations. So I think it's at the same time that like commercialization of space proceeded significantly. So with those trends, I think Japan needs international collaboration, like space domain awareness with the US, Australia, and others, and also working with the startup is essential to achieve those national security goals.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. It's extraordinary actually to think about, and coming back to, I think, a theme that's been really consistent with all of our panel members. Space allows us to see things in real time or near real time that we otherwise wouldn't. And once again, this used to be very secretive, and it used to be all about nuclear command and control and ballistic missile tracking. But now, when you see on your television screens, the impact of conflict, and you're seeing it, immediately. Yes, you've got ground shots from the ground, but some of the most impactful, important, and revealing, particularly from a military perspective in terms of responding, are the images that you get from space. They really are vitally important. Thank you for that, Kome. Raj, you are a living, breathing example of Australia-India collaboration. And your company, Space Machines, has gone on a little bit of a journey itself. Can you tell us what Space Machines is doing? What's driving where you're going now, and what's helping close your business case for your company?
Thanks for that, Beck. I think it's been great to hear the panel. And I think what we've heard so far is um, because of the proliferation in space with lowering the cost to access space, space is critical. It's part of our daily lives, almost every aspect of our life. It's getting congested. There is a debris problem that's growing exponentially. It is contested. Nations are putting a lot of budget from a security point of view to secure their presence in space. And as you start to think about that, the question you're left to ask is, what happens if something goes wrong? What happens if something doesn't work? What if something is under threat? How do you collaborate? How do you find solutions in space when there is so much critical infrastructure being built into space by different countries? And so when you think about the model that exists on Earth, you've got ambulances, and you've got fire engines, and you've got police, you've got institutions that protect, technology that protects. So Space Machine is really about how do we provide the first response of capabilities that allow critical infrastructure to be protected, to be secured, to be sustained in orbit. And I think there are two different lenses to it. One's a security lens. Security underpins a lot of sustainability. So how do you move from securing something, creating a rule-based order, and then starting to sustain it? So for us, the vision of the company is to safeguard space for humanity's future. And why safeguard? Because safeguard is not only what you're protecting, but who you're protecting it for. And so those are two sides of the same coin. And a great example of that is, how we see us being an Australian company and why Australia. And you think about US, lots of great space heritage, lots of capital. You see other countries with great space heritage. And Australia is in this unique pool of why would you start a business in Australia? And I think, and it sort of resonates with the theme of this whole forum, which is in some way, emerging nations like Australia have a role to translate trust.
Yeah.
We provide that bridge between um, countries that are working on um, space technology and countries that are on the sustainability side of things and countries are on the security side of things. And so for us, it's been really interesting journey. And a great example of that's been a project that's supported by the Australian government called Space Maitri between India and Australia. And as part of that mission, we're going to inspect and characterize debris so we can find better solutions for it. And we're starting to now incorporate Japanese and the Americans and expanding that mission. So there is transparency, there is sharing of data on how you make it sustainable. But in doing so, you provide first response and a first response that's proportional to the activity that's happening in space. And so far, from my perspective, in some way securing is important from what we do. But from an Australian perspective, we've got to be that bridge. I think somebody said, I can't attribute the quote, but space has no borders, but it still needs a bridge.
Terrific. Well, we've taken a range of lenses here, but I hope, if nothing else, you've taken away just how vital space is for so many different reasons, but also how space can act as an organizing concept or an organizing principle, if you like, for a lot of other technological endeavors, and particularly, as Ord said, I think really nicely for innovation. Well, if you're going to get into space and you're working in space, you have to innovate because this is a demanding, harsh, difficult environment. There's another aspect to this, of course, where I talked at the start about how space is democratized, and really that was about the lowering of cost and the access, which is allowing even individual actors to put payloads into space and do really, really interesting things. But I just want to ask the panel before I throw to the floor, so please, if you have a question, get ready. Another thing, when we were talking yesterday, a disturbing trend, really, and it's true that the geopolitics of the Earth are reflected in the astropolitics of space, so to speak. But Chris, I think you called it something of a balkanization as well, and this is one of those forces that we want to work against as much as we can, because space really needs us to be hewing in the same direction. Can you talk a little bit more about that, and anyone else on the panel who wants to add?
Yeah, so I think where space has been an area of actually extreme diplomacy. I mean, the U.S. and Russia have been working together. Probably the only sphere that we work together uncontested, for decades now, in the International Space Station. In the U.S., they've launched the Artemis Accords with dozens of companies that have joined that. So there's a lot of collaboration that's going on. But the reality of the commercial space industry is you have individual actors, individual companies that are trying to drive profits. They're not necessarily looking to do international partnerships. If you look at a company like SpaceX, entirely vertically integrated, they've sort of rolled over most of the competition in any place that they've gone, and there is no room for collaboration with internationally or with any other company in most cases. So the challenge, I would say, is space by its definition is a dual use environment. Rockets, I mean, you can take off a satellite and you can easily put on a nuclear weapon, right? So this has always been a controlled technology, and there's always been a balance between the two. So, in one case, you can look at Earth observation. There's a bunch of public companies that either take images or hyperspectral, images or thermal or radar, and they're using it in Ukraine. They're using it for environmental monitoring, for carbon monitoring, and methane, and all these things to improve the Earth. But like everything that's dual use, there can also be another side to it. So I could go on the internet right now and I could dial up probably about 25 satellite images of this building. And you can do that, every day of the week. There are now hundreds of satellites, imaging satellites up there, taking pictures of you every single day. To some people, that's reassuring, but it can also be, a little bit disturbing based upon how that information is used and who is using it.
Did anyone else want to offer a perspective on that?
Just one thing about SpaceX and Starship and everything that is being developed there. I think the question is, what is it that you're trying to do? Because Starship is like a bus. It will just dispose of you wherever the mission goes. If you want a taxi ride, you will take a Rocket Lab or an Ariane 6. So it's always, what is it that you want to do? Same thing with the LEO and GEO. A lot of people are saying, oh, GEO are dead because now it's everything in LEO. Again, it depends. A company like Australia, having one GEO that can deliver all the space services that Australia needs is best. LEO is good for when you need low latency in your services. And I can think of traders or gamers who really need that. So it's not for everybody. So the question is really, what is the best technology I need to answer a specific need? And we always need to think back to what is the need and what is the application, what we're wanting to develop. I think it's very important to keep that in mind.
I was going to just really quickly say also, I think there's a sense in the emerging players that they need to have more self-sufficiency around access to space. So we're starting to see folks deciding that because it's critical infrastructure, we have benefited from exquisite gifts, specifically from the US, around GNSS services, weather, satellites, so many things, Landsat, that have been given to the world effectively for free. But we're also now saying, okay, well, actually, we are so dependent on those services. What does that do if the US has some kind of issue or if there's some kind of even technical challenge? So I think there's also a trend in this balkanization. There's a counter trend, which is, okay, let's build more of a full stack from, what they say, nose cone to tail, launch right through to operating. And how we might do that at a national level, but I think, to Ord's suggestion, how we might also start doing that regionally. What kind of a great mission could we do together? Qatar, Australia, Japan, countries coming together with capability, with capital, with interesting problems to deal some of the biggest issues, and do that as an and to the US capabilities, as an add-on and value add within that framework. So I think that's probably the more hopeful message I'd like to leave. Yeah.
And I like that hopeful message. Australia has just accredited its first Australian astronaut, which was an extraordinary achievement. We'd really hoped that we might be able to get her here today, but we couldn't. And we need to get her on a mission. And I think it will genuinely take the collaboration of every country represented on this panel and more for us to achieve that. But it's really, really important that we do that and more. Questions from the audience. I think we've got a couple of minutes left. I've got two at the front, one and here if we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much for fascinating presentations and great questions from the moderator. I'm a French senator. I just have one question, simple one, I think. This is a common space to us all. We have a common space at sea, on oceans, but we have rules to regulate maritime, traffic. So is there a will today, political will, to come together and have some kind of regulation before space becomes too crowded, too polluted, and too contested? Thank you.
But that is a really brilliant question. I'm going to ask everybody to provide a really quick answer on that because I think you might get slightly different answers from all of our panelists. Let's start with you, Kome, perhaps, and come this way. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. For maritime domain awareness is, I think, areas we can collaborate. Also, the space traffic control is, I think, for everybody's interest. So regardless geopolitical tensions we see recently, I think it's a common interest to every country cooperate and set a rule to notify the launchings of debris or on operations in space.
Thank you. Raj, what's your view?
I think we have to be proactive. We're at a unique moment in history where terrestrially you have laws and they're still trying to catch up with the technology. And I think in space you've got this unique opportunity where there is a time at the moment where rules, technology, geopolitics, collaboration, all are a unique convergence. And so being proactive will help. So there are rules, but I think there is a whole bunch of other combinations that will lead to that.
Super quickly, ITU, the International Telecommunication Unit, I don't remember what was the union, is regulating the orbits, the spectrum, and all that. But you are right; it's becoming a big issue. There is a lot of junks up there, and everybody has to play. And someone was saying in the previous panel, laws are meaningless if there is no enforcement. How do you enforce things in space? That's becoming very, very complicated. But there is like 100 millions of objects smaller than 1 centimeter that we can't even measure and know where they are. So it is a big issue and a big problem. Space law is becoming a big topic.
After World War II, we had an incredible achievement, which was ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. And that organization, if it changes a regulation in Zurich, it's automatically law here in Qatar, in Australia, in North Korea, in Iran, in Moscow, automatically. So we have done it before. So I think we need an international civil space organization to help regulate this. And I think it requires that same kind of international push and to achieve that.
Did you want to add?
Yeah, real quick. There's basically two space laws that were passed, both in the 1960s, the Moon Treaty and the Outer Space Treaty, which are very broad and general laws. And I hate to say it, but we need more lawyers. There's not a lot of people who have this specialty. It's very similar to Admiralty law, and I'm a Navy guy. So I say we just go with Admiralty law, but the rules of the road are not well formed, and they will need to be, and we'll have to do that jointly. Because right now the debris problem is a problem of the commons, right? There is no organization that can enforce or force companies to remove their debris. So I did a project for a government agency to look at the prospect for debris removal, and when I interviewed companies, the sum, the average, the mean, the median, and the mode was zero. They were going to pay nothing to remove debris. The FCC, FAA, they're passing laws now that say you have to get rid of your debris. That's just in the US. So companies in the US are going to have to put on propulsion. They're doing it in Europe also, but we need that to happen everywhere.
It's a brilliant parallel that you draw, and many do, that the high seas as a global commons and space as a global commons. We've got UNCLOS and law of the sea, and you know whether or not we can achieve anything like that, given the fractious nature of geopolitics today, is questionable. But like everyone has said on this panel, I think the effort has got to be there to try. We've really got to stay dedicated to seeing that outcome. Do we have time to squeeze one more? No. I'm so sorry. If you'd like to talk to the panel afterwards, I'm sure we'd love to hear from you. I apologize. Please join me in thanking the panel today.